This is, as some of you know, a repetition of something I made in Frankfurt when we met there. It's a sort of a sales show. I want to present my last book because the Anglophones amongst you have certainly not seen it, and those who have maybe read it or seen it, I will also add new ideas in this presentation. But it gives you, those who don't know the book yet, some basic ideas that I deal with in this book. So, already in 1989, Wilhelm Flusser accused the forgetfulness of philosophy concerning colors. He writes, it's my rough translation, and sorry. In the Western tradition, form is synonymous with container, morphe, and this container is considered empty there. On the other hand, it is assumed that phenomena are formless, amorph, and that they flow from the past into the future. Human reason is understood as that act thanks to which appearances are poured into forms. Through this filling of forms with appearances, the forms gain content, meaning, and the appearances become ordered and can be dealt with. The act of filling forms with appearances is called formalizing, and its result is called informing. Flusser attributes this to an early cultural technique, primitive cartography, which makes the imagination colorless, accessible, and collectively usable. I'm going to return to this aspect of collectively usable towards the end of this talk. This dominance of form leads not only to an epistemology of lists and symbols, but also to a problematic global subjection of the world through formalization. Faced with this epistemic one-way, where everything physical dissolves into forms and numbers and digital particles without coherence, Flusser sets in motion what could be called the discovery of color. Flusser himself, however, has the treatment of color codes in mind. The coupling of color thinking with formal thinking thus unfortunately leads him to go beyond the essentials of color and back into the dominion of form and number. Against Flusser's own proposal to codify colors, it seems more plausible to me to take up his original impulse and to see both the basis and the excess of forms in colors. The central question is, what happens when one acts in or on color? What other mental, cultural, social operations are made possible by dyeing, by coloring, by painting? The aim would be a theory that encompasses the operations of coloring, a theory of thinking in color. In his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Ludwig Wittgenstein placed Färbigkeit, coloredness, alongside the Kantian epistemic categories of space and time and described them not as forms of apprehending, but as forms of objects. Wittgenstein recognizes, perhaps as the first, the fundamental dependence of our thinking, recognition, and statements, not only on space and time, but also on the colored qualities of objects. He wrote, Raum, Zeit und Farbe, Färbigkeit, sind Formen der Gegenstände. According to this fundamental intuition of the Tractatus, color is, along with time and space, a concrete and individualizing property of objects, and not just a subjective tool of ordering perceptions. Wittgenstein formulates it hesitantly. In my opinion, the addition of the term Färbigkeit in square brackets needs an explanation. The word is coined by Wittgenstein. Färbigkeit, coloredness, accompanying the word Farbe, color, indicates that color is to be understood here both as an abstract continuum like space and time on the one hand, for otherwise he would have chosen place or point in time. But on the other hand, he sees them as essential characteristic of the respective object. The English term coloredness, it seems to me, highlights the fact that the color has been added or attributed to the object, whereas Färbigkeit signifies a substantial quality. Moreover, the German term also evokes a plurality and indicates the object in its diversity of colors and its nuanced aspects, modulated in one way or another in the color continuum. Moreover, it also evokes an active quality such that objects radiate or spray color. Färbigkeit means both being colored, Gefärbtheit, and coloring, Farbigkeit, in the sense of an artificial multicoloring, Buntheit, of a respective color value through which things in our perception are singled out and distinguished from each other. Wittgenstein's expression thus marks a dialectical movement between three positions. First, a conception of color as a priori, condition of possibility of perception. Second, a concept of color as a posteriori, how it actually appears. And third, a concept of color as substance. This threefold conception comes more explicit in his posthumously published Remarks on Color. Here, Wittgenstein starts from the observation that determining the relationship between colors is either a matter of logical analysis or of comparative perception. The concept of white implies that it is brighter than black, white and black being the opposite extreme ends of color concepts regarding brightness. If we talk about the colors of concrete bodies in perception, however, the determination of the relationship between two colors always depends on the circumstances, so that it is not possible to make general statements because one always finds an arrangement in which, for example, an orange body appears brighter than an actual white body. Although measured abstractly on an ideal scale, actual white is brighter than orange. According to Wittgenstein, the possibility of an internal and logical analysis of ideal color relations lies in common usage, from which internal relations are derived or constructed. In this respect, an ideal color scale is always developed abstractly from concrete color experiences and according to culturally specific parameters. What counts as pure white, for example, depends on these parameters. According to Wittgenstein's remarks, then, we will never dispose of a universal color scale, for example, based on wavelengths, but only different possibilities of determination. Although it is possible to create extremely detailed color tables and colors that can be numerically normalized to avoid the semantics of color names, a consistent logic of color classes and terms is not in sight. The colors I see are not independent of the color terms available to me, and furthermore, color vision is not identical to the measurement of light waves or correct application of color concepts. For the fact that something is considered a color is not due to light waves or nerve irritations, but to the grid of what can be imagined as color, which, from Wittgenstein's point of view, is based on concrete language games. The color properties of white and black, for example, do not only differ in terms of brightness. Between two shades of white and two shades of black, there are different perceptible relationships, not only those of lightness contrasts, but also those of reflection and absorption or brightness, satiety or dullness. Can we say that a certain red and a certain blue are equally bright? Since there is not enough of a scale such as brightness or some other similar criterion to account for the differences in the color palette, we cannot say in which respect colors are the same. And that's a famous quote from Wittgenstein where he says such a thing, that basically we lack a concept of color equality. But it is not only because in some situations a white does not appear brighter than a gray or a yellow. The properties of colors are disparate and dynamic. The systematic graduation of brightness, saturation, and hue are not enough. The diversity of color parameters seems hopeless as soon as you make the shift from colors to coloredness, Färbigkeit. According to Wittgenstein, parameters such as saturation and hue are crisscrossed by brilliance, madness, transparency, shadow, shimmer, brightness, reflection, sparkle, absorption, chromaticity, shining, etc., as they all play a role in our everyday color experience. But after these remarks pertaining to the perception of how colors appear in concrete situations, Wittgenstein goes on to consider the coloring effect one thing has on another. Here, Wittgenstein differentiates between material colors, surface colors, and visual colors. So this term of Stofffarben is very decisive here. In contrast to psychology, which opposes the apparent impression to a real thing. Wittgenstein wants to stay with appearances. That's sort of the basic claim that his remarks on color end with. He wants to stay with appearances. So in the final instance, colors are a matter of appearance and not structures of radiance or reflection patterns of light, as our deceased friend Fabian Dorsch once insisted. So I think he was wrong thinking that the physical qualities of wavelengths of reflection patterns actually identify colors. The determinability of colors always depend on concrete locations and the practices of seeing. The respective perception of colors of an object is therefore linked to cultural practices from which the logic of color concepts cannot be detached. For example, it is argued whether the Greeks saw blue because apparently they lacked the corresponding concept. But look at color names such as rose, violet, purple, orange, or khaki. They once broke away from concrete objects, the rose, the violet, the purple, the orange, the khaki, and then became color concepts. Therefore, in addition to seeing and naming colors, on which Wittgenstein focuses, we should also look at coloring practices in order to understand which color relations dominate a culture. For the hypothesis I want to suggest is that only the practices of coloring establish a concept of color that does not reduce it to a secondary property of things or predicates of disposition, but tries to grasp it in its own essence. The dispositions of color, independent of the respective object on which the color appears, causes the perception of color as a sensible quality. What we call form is actually the boundary between individual colors. Inscriptions, symbols, geometric figures are not colorless, but actually colors in different shapes distributed along a colored surface. However, there are no strict boundaries between colors. Rather, they are nothing more than transitions, nuances, intensities. Strictly speaking, colors are the condition of all visual forming processes. If forms like numbers are elements of cultural techniques, colors form the basis of all these graphic and epistemic operations. How we perceive colored things certainly depends on our visual faculty and also on our color imagination. However, the color in which the world opens up to us depend above all on the color substances and their interactions. Color substances, Stofffarben, as Wittgenstein called them, determine the way in which attention relates to an object and how, despite change or movement, its appearance can be perceived as something unified. We perceive objects visually to the extent that they are colored. However, the contribution not only of colors but of coloring to the knowledge of the world has hardly been investigated so far. The insights of color theory, color biology, and the psychology of perception show the dependence of our color vision on the physiology of the eye and on cognition. So most of these theories are cognitive theories anyway. These theories treat color as refractory light and prove that color vision serves all color-sensitive creatures to orient themselves in their environment and to shape it. For as soon as a living being can distinguish color, it is able to segment objects and scenes, that's the list you see here, to group objects and distinguish them from their shadow or from mere appearance, to detect contours, textures, and shapes, even in confusing sceneries and murky media. It is able to perceive spatial and temporal depth as well as movements, to judge the inner state of something, for instance, its ripeness, and to respond to biological, social, and cultural signals. Philosophical color theory has so far assumed that objects have colors as secondary properties. In the world of these philosophies, the tomato is red, the lemon yellow, and the sky blue. The fact that colors become, change, detach from objects and interact with each other seem to have been overlooked here. Dyeing and coloring have rarely been studied theoretically, although many epistemic practices highlight reality only through coloring. Only think of current COVID tests producing one stripe or two. Many of these epistemic practices would not be possible in a monochrome world on the basis of pure forms only. So what do we understand through color and through color contrasts only? This visual thinking is not identical with image consciousness, as coloring can take place without reference to image. to visual representation or to expressive pictorial gestures. The particularity of coloring lies primarily in the modulating action of color, which creates its own field of action and its own zone of perception. Coloring not only includes the marking and coloring of particles, waves, cells, surfaces, reliefs, fabrics, and bodies with layers, color contrasts, and surface textures, but also the creation of what it is to be seen, in terms of color and gesture. Coloring is not in itself an aesthetic practice, but at least for humans, a cultural technique. It is epistemologically relevant because it produces evidence in many scientific practices, not just illustrations. It experiments with the differentiation and nuance of colors to impose contrasts, depth, and correlations from distance. But coloring not only makes visible in medicine, biology, chemistry, brain research, or astrophysics, to name but a few fields, things that would otherwise remain hidden as numerical values or simple contours. It does not limit itself to coloring, but it changes the world. Coloring is a way of world-making, as one could say with Nelson Goodman. Coloring is also a foundation insofar as drawing and understanding, disegno and concetto, line and contour. The setting up of signs, writing, and arithmetic always have a foundation of color as a precondition, almost as a technical cultural a priori. Working with light, colors, profiles, volumes, shadows, and movements tends to advance to a point where things begin to move out of context, continuum, and limits of ordinary perception. This is where painting starts. And I now come to a section where from coloring I concentrate on painting. So painting doesn't only consist of coloring, of course. There's many aspects of painting that have not to do only with coloring. But I'm interested in what you learn about color and about how the world appears through painting. The coloring of a specimen and the application of dye to cloth can be distinguished from the most simple forms of painting, like painting of walls or furniture, for instance, in that painting can generally be defined as an exploration of color. Coloring in the process of painting not only adds color to a surface and not necessarily depicts objects in space. However, it necessarily produces a subjectivity whose sense of color makes objects appear. Hegel, basing his discussion on painting on Diderot's and Schelling's approaches, claims that only a subjective sense of color shapes the way of seeing and conceiving color tones, and represents the individual attempt to capture and reproduce the, as he writes, multiple play of color notes, and to invent according to one's own perception, experience, and imagination. But this subjective sense comes from coloring. Coloring establishes and sustains specific spatial relations. Here you see the famous quote from his Aesthetics, where he parties coloring. It is incredible what mere coloring accomplishes here. So you see that he already underlines the fact that many spatial relations and differences in appearance, grouping, etc., can only be seen, perceived through coloring. These characteristics of coloring determine the content of the painting, traditionally understood. The coloring gives a sense of the situation and the particular. The essential thing about a painting is that it represents a situation, a scene for action, if you follow Hegel. To grasp the world in its colors through painting would thus be to grasp it in its particularity, diversity, and reality. It is to understand how the world distributes saliences of focused attention and affordances for action. It provides us with the precision of a sense for the singular, a sense for deep time. What does painting teach us about colors? Seeing a color results in an impression composed of several chromatic tones in a colored space, you might say. Claude Romano, who attributes this view to Eugène Chevreul, writing at about the same time as Schelling and Hegel, proposes a new phenomenology of color. Here's a quote. It's, of course, again, my translation that I follow here. The perception of colors is a fundamentally holistic phenomenon, as the psychology of form insisted after Chevreul and the painters. In a sense, we never perceive a color on its own. We perceive a set of colors resonating and contrasting with each other against a background of spatial coexistence. the perception of each color depends on that of all the others. Romano's approach, based on Merleau-Ponty, thus presupposes a perceptual totality or a differential system in which local hues stabilize only through consonance and dissonance. To paint, for Romano, is to deploy the power of color to establish a system of relationships. The impression of a color is always the result of an interaction of colors. Colors act on each other and between themselves according to the principles of simultaneity and succession, contrast and harmony, complementarity and shading, consonance and dissonance, opposition and synthesis. Knowledge of these and other principles inspired new painting techniques. Impressionism, from Romano's point of view, emancipated colors by separating them from the surface of things and linking them to the impression. Each color is first of all an entanglement of simultaneity and sequence, and it takes shape in a field of transitions and variations, as Romano emphasizes with Merleau-Ponty. The clash of individual colors is thus based on a play of colors and things which can suddenly separate and make visible the fabric from which things emerge. Painted color has depth, so it is the very locus of an experience of being, says Romano. Color has depth because it is the very locus of an experience of being as such, which the painter seeks to translate and perpetuate. The painter does not experience color on one side and the world on the other. He experiences the world in and through color. It is also at this point that Romano finds reasons to criticize Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach. The sensual epiphany of color remains coupled, especially in his late philosophy, to the supposed link of one's own flesh with the flesh of the world, chair, the basic term of Merleau-Ponty. The concept of flesh in Merleau-Ponty is only conceivable, says Claude Romano, in the perspective of a constitution by a pure ego, of which it remains an appendage. On the other hand, the idea of a flesh of the world, chair du monde, remains within the framework of a transcendental subjectivism of constitution. But if the flesh of the world were only a form of subjectivation, Merleau-Ponty's research could not go beyond the idealist framework of Husserl's phenomenology. Romano contrasts this idealism with the objectivity, aesthetic obstinacy, and singularity of color. Color is a world because it possesses an inimitable rhythm, vibration, dynamics, spatiality, affective resonance. The resonance of colored vibrations includes the impulse of movement they affect. Romano refers to Delaunay's theory that complementary colors, like green and red, are associated with slow movements, while dissonant colors are associated with fast movements, like red and blue. The perceived colors exhibit motor tendencies. That is, they inspire, facilitate, or make more difficult certain behaviors, according to Romano. When colors show motor tendencies and trigger or prevent movements, this is due to an association of the senses, which must be realized by the colors themselves, and which is not always guaranteed by a constitutive flesh. So this is, so to speak, the critique that Romano opposes to the idealism of the phenomenology, the proper sense that is inspired by the colors themselves. Color, this is the quote I wanted you to read. Color is a world, we said, because it has its own depth, its own vibration and radiance, its own rhythm, its own way of addressing our affective tones because it communicates with other perceptual modalities. It is always a total property and, if we may say so, a mode of presentation of the whole itself. Yet, if Romano wants to get out of the transcendental subjectivism of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, the question arises to what is this whole, this totality of experience? What delimits and constitutes the system of differences, if not the pure ego or the structure of the body? For the canvas or the field in which the differences of colors unfold do not present themselves so easily in an objective whole, because they also disperse, they hide, they interlock in sequences, they remain latent. So there is no permanent presence of colors and no affordances simultaneously given with this presence. Painting offers a disposition in a perceptual situation that would be actualized and completed, even if not constituted by a concrete perceptual interaction, but which transposes its virtualities, its resources, its power each time. If there is a whole, it is made of agonal forces and latencies. Color corresponds to an architecture of the environment and to a specific interaction with this environment. The environment is articulated differently depending on whether I color it by lighting or by the application of pigments, translucency, or composition. Coloring produces appearances. The ecstasy of things is particularly tinged with color, one might say. There are properties of color that inform us about our environment from which they are distinguished. Color is not only on or near objects. Color can also simply carry the atmosphere of a space. Colors are apparent things par excellence. Colors result both from the physical interaction with the perceiving body, like flesh or Leib in German, and from the contrast of the environment, from the out of focus and from the out of color. Color vision is not a multi-sensory color detector only. The use of sensory organs and movements in this environment, the way I pick up and process color stimuli, influences what is given as color and should therefore be understood as part of coloration. Moreover, in painting, I respond not only to the interaction of colors with the environment, but also to other beholders. Therefore, I would like to draw your attention now to the chemical, plastic, sculptural, and the interactive aspects of color. In painting, color emancipates itself from the object. Here it is neither a colorful light nor a mere attribute. It also emancipates itself from the graphic intention of representation. This painterly pictoriality plays a central role in many practices and theories of painting. Georges Didier-Balman, for example, describes it with the expression point de peinture. Point de peinture means a pure event of the plastic paint. For it is impossible to think of a painting in which the painted color itself does not interrupt the system of representation at some point. It is not then a mere means to an end of illustration. On the contrary, writes Georges Didier-Balman, it is, on the other hand, a matter of matter, matière, and layers. And there we are led back to the application of paint, from which every painterly representation draws its capital or background at will. And on the other hand, it is a matter of shock and fatal consternation, what one might call a trauma, a shock, a swarm of color. A point de peinture is a rag, a stain or a field of color, a disturbing area, something that captures the attention. Accordingly, paintings are not merely descriptive images, representations of something in which details come together to form an overall view. Unlike the detail, which is subordinate to this representational intention and which remains apart in relation to this whole, the point de peinture is the peculiarity of the work with paint. The whole difference between the photographic reproduction of a painting and the direct confrontation with it lies here. Precisely the aesthetic proper time, the viscosity and temporality, the modulation and plasticity of color can only be experienced in front of the painting. They are the visual which steps out of the visibility and describability of the painting and require a multimodal, tactile, olfactory perception. Fields of color leap out of the painting, fleeing into a kind of para-objectivity and provoking us to bring our senses into play anew against each other. Here the chemical processes come to the fore, the processes of mixing and composition, the time of drying, the power of appearance. Color gradients refer to the fact that the paintings are made and are at the same time the trail that the painter follows with her instruments and intentions. Guillaume Casgrain therefore also speaks of a principled materialism in painting. For the drops of paint, he says, are the anachronistic symptoms of a manipulation of matter that readily override any distance and idealizing aesthetic perception. The color stain, which he calls coulure in French, draws attention to the color matter, but also to the technical operations that have stirred a stable image out of the liquid color. As soon as the color stain draws attention to itself, the image illusion collapses. A colorful expansion only becomes a reason for painting through this attention grabbing. The color stain drives the surface out of itself and remains, in contrast to photographic images, vibrating and fluid. The plasticity and indeterminacy of the color surface, which never quite dries up, carry out a rebellion against the images they represent, because behind this representation, behind the scenes and figurations, they show how identifiable things, like forms and symbols, are based on colors. They show what the colors can do. They thus show the origin of seeing in what there is to see. Painting thus demonstrates at the same time how the world is created from colors and that there is not only one world. Painting is not, first of all, as Jason Geiger once defined, the distribution of colors and shapes on a surface, but introduces the first differentiations in color between surface and ground. It thereby provides a requirement of graphic operations, namely the flat surface. In German, you can differentiate between Fläche and Oberfläche. In English and French, it's not so easily renderable, but here I differentiate then between surface and flat surface in order to highlight the fact that Fläche is a fact that's created by painterly techniques, painterly operations, and mainly by features of color itself, and is not necessarily a result of flattening things, of shaping things, but rather of color. So that's the claim here. Painting annuls the three-dimensional surrounding space as well as that which is otherwise perceived as being behind or underneath it. A synoptic overview is created through flatness. This is the constitutive operation in painting. Painted flat surfaces precede graphic operations such as marking and color differentiation. This synoptic surface, however, stands out from a spatial and temporal depth, a color latency field that causes us to see something as something. This painterly flatness is an objective arrangement which focuses us to see imaginatively. And that's the claim I want to end with. I want to analyze in which way paintings force us to see not, as I would call it, optically, but imaginatively. So there's a large part of imagination in seeing, but still there's a direct confrontation with something. And I want to get at that. When we see imaginatively, we see A equals B, X counts as Y, etc. The latency of color effects brings intersubjective acts of imagination into play. And here I just give you a few examples that you know what I'm talking about. I want to highlight your attention to the fact that painting is not, especially in contemporary painterly practice, is not anymore, a flat thing on the wall. And however, there is some kind of flatness that appears across the colors. And there's a second aspect that is important here. It's that you're confronted with something that you cannot identify easily. You don't know what you're seeing. You're seeing something, you don't know what it is. And then there's a third aspect that is important. You do it together with others. So it's not an accident that I've brought pictures where there's a certain interaction with other people where you interactively deal out what you're seeing. And I want to understand painting here as a sort of an externalized imagination. So you sort of act out, deal out what it is that you are confronted with in these situations. That's what I'll try to analyze here. So the latency of color effects, or maybe you've got that too, I think that there's a lot of latency of colors that comes into play in certain situations. And there's not only one fixed aspect once and for all in paintings. So latency is an important aspect of the color applied in painting. The latency of color effects brings intersubjective acts of imagination into play. We act out what it could be that we see. We act out what it could be that we see. How else can one think for a collective subject the use of imaginations? While drawings and signs are already based on identification, determination, and convention, that is, on collective imagination, painting surfaces provoke the imagination in the first place, not individually behind the brow, but intersubjectively in collective action. For coloring precedes imagination, which, as Walter Benjamin stated, is unconstructive, purely formative, or, from the subject's point of view, purely negative. That's a Benjamin quote. Coloring negates the identity and function of objects, forms, and senses, which you easily see in this example. By the way, what I show you here are works on the left side from you of Sam Gilliam. It's called Double Merge from 1968, and the other examples are from Katharina Grosse. The one is Rockaway from in New York, 2016, and the other one above is Wunderbild in Prague from 2018. So the painterly coloring is an act of productive imagination that negates what is given, like in the example of the house here, which is an orange carrying house. Or otherwise a housely orange. Before it makes anything visible, the painting field erases what was previously considered visible present. This determination of the present opens the view for the possible, for what could be, but was not valid until now. This now perceived in conflicting modalities, optical and tactile, and not identify. In this way, the painting stain then invites imagination, exposing the spontaneity of material interactions. When the eye senses its way forward along these spots, something unimaginable becomes visible, is to happen in reality. Something imaginary is to become manifest. This creates, on this side of identification and determination, a new kind of interaction surface of collective imagining. Only with painting, imaginative formative practices become intersubjectively operable. This intersubjective imagination stirred by painting tries to develop a sense for the preconditions and relations on which new qualities, forms, shapes, schemes, characteristics, and visual rules are based. Whenever something catches our eye and we see it very sharply and clearly, but still don't know what it is, and we don't even know what color we are seeing, as it is constantly changing, as we and others move before and between it, we ask ourselves what visual information we are missing or what thought we should suppress in order to be able to identify it. We don't know how to position ourselves and where to direct our bodies and our senses. Painting stands like a para-object, like a question between us and the others. Collective imagination is called upon. It is through the manifestation of color latency that a space is opened up for the negotiation of collective attention and effective time. This also provokes new usages of our bodies, new collective movements. The exchange of imaginations often then passes with gestures and ways to look, but also in searching words and expressions. Paintings then are not equivalents of something real, which we could optically see, but objects which make us see something merely possible, configurations of what is intersubjectively present and what is absent, differentiations of simultaneity and succession, of surface and ground, of what is and what becomes. Thus, painting shapes a spatial and a temporal sense of the colors. Painting is a collective act of thinking in color. That's all for today. Thanks you.